The offset formula allows you to reference dynamic ranges in Excel. In this video, we'll walk through the basics of this powerful but often underutilized formula and real-life examples for you to implement in your day-to-day job.
So what does the offset formula do? Offset returns a reference to a range that is a given number of rows and columns from a given reference. If I select the middle of my table with my offset, and then if I put 0, 0, I just return that cell because I haven't offset that cell reference at all. If I were to return one additional column, I'd return the cell in E8 as I've moved my reference down one row. If I were to add one column, I would return the cell reference in F8 as I have moved one row down and one column to the right. If I were to use negatives, so -1 rows, and I'll just make this 0 columns, I've returned the cell reference in E6 as I've moved up one row and I haven't changed the column. Same with my columns. I can go -1 and I have -1 row, -1 column. So the cell reference in D6. All an offset will do is it will adjust your formula reference to return a different cell. So the offset formula will be helpful in manipulating your references when you need dynamic ranges. Let's walk through two examples to understand when you might want to use this formula. This is a sample lookup table where we have different categories of fruits in different states, and what we want to return is the manager for each one of those fruit categories and states. One way you could do this is with an XLOOKUP. So if I write XLOOKUP, my lookup value will be my fruit category, my lookup array will be my fruit category in my lookup table, and then my return array could be the different states, right? I could fill that in, I could use F4, and then if I drag that down, that works for California. But if I wanted to fill that in for Oregon, I'd need to change this cell reference to be, instead of column H, column I. And I guess I could go through and update this, but in Excel, usually updating formula references individually is not the preferred methodology. What you could also do is use an offset. And so if I instead put offset and I want to offset this first cell reference by 0 rows and 0 columns, I could fill that down, and then for this second section, I could just offset it by 1 column and I could fill that down. And now this second section is referring to column I because I've offset my return array to return column I. And if I use the evaluate formula tool, we can really easily see that I've looked up bananas on the offset of H10 to H16, which returns I10 to I16. And now I've done an XLOOKUP on the value of bananas on the lookup array of G10 through G16, the return array of I10 through I16, which returns Danielle. I wouldn't recommend going through and changing these column numbers directly. One pretty clever thing you could do is you could use a match here, and you could match your state to your lookup array, F4 to lock that in place, exact match, and then just subtract 1 from your columns as your match will automatically be 1. And so if I fill that down, I have a really dynamic two-dimensional lookup with a combination of XLOOKUP, offset, and match. If you're interested in that, I actually made a separate video on two-dimensional lookups, and I will link that above. Here we have an example of monthly revenue for a number of different customers. So store one had $1,520 in revenue in March, $1,260 in April. These represent different customers in different periods of time. One analysis you might want to understand is how many of your customers have made a purchase or an order in the last 3 months or in any given period of months. So what you could do is use an if statement and write if sum of your last 3 periods is greater than 0, then 1, otherwise 0. And so I can fill that to the right, I can fill that down. And now I have a really simple count where I have 6 customers who purchased within the last 3 months in March of 2020. And I can do that for all of my successive periods. And I can calculate what is the percent of customers that have purchased within a given time frame. The challenge with this approach is if I wanted to maybe change this to 6 months, I can't update that easily. And it's challenging for me to have a really dynamic toggle between different periods of time in case I want to understand which customers have purchased in the last 3 months or 6 months or 12 months. One way to solve this problem is by using an offset. what I can do is I can go in and instead of referring to this range directly, I can build this range with an offset. And if I write offset, my reference will be the current month I'm in. I don't want to move it any rows. I want to offset my columns to the left. So I want a negative of my toggle, F4 to lock that in place, +1, as I want to move my cell reference 2 columns to the left. My height, I want to be 1 for 1 row. And then my width, I want to be equal to the toggle, as I want 3 columns in my array. If I close that parentheses and hit OK, now I can simply copy that formula throughout the rest of my sheet, and I built the same formula reference. So if I use evaluate formula, Alt MV, I can see I have the sum of the offset of D7, which is -3 + 1, so 2 columns to the left, with a height of 1 and a width of 3. So my offset returns B7 through D7, the same range reference that we had originally put in. If that sum is greater than 0, then we return 1, otherwise we return 0. And the great part about this is I can now update this toggle. So if I wanted to look at which customers had purchased in the last 6 months, now I'll receive some ref errors as these formulas cannot be written correctly. But if I go over to June and use evaluate formula, I have an offset of G7, which is -6 + 1, so 5 columns to the left, a height of 1, and then a width of 6 columns. So I'm returning the sum of B7 through G7. And if that sum is greater than 0, return 1, otherwise return 0. So if you see at the beginning of our range, we're getting these ref errors. That's because Excel cannot refer to the current range. I'm trying to offset cell D7 by -5 rows, which will return a ref error as C is the 4th column. So Excel has no way of referring to a cell that does not exist. What I could use is I could use an if error, and I could write if error, and then at the end of my formula, just put double quotation 4 blanks. And that would work, and that would remove the errors from those first 2 cells. But you see how in May, we still get a reference because we're still able to refer to the 6 columns from store 1 to May, where I actually think this is honestly just a little confusing. Like, it isn't necessarily wrong as it's showing the right value, but there may have been a purchase in December of last year that we're not capturing and potentially showing store 10 is not a customer where maybe they actually have purchased in the last 6 months. So if instead of using an if error, what I might actually just want to do is use a if statement on the column number. If you don't know, Excel has a column formula that will return the column number of a specific reference. So if I reference this cell, it will tell me column 4. If I reference this cell, column 5, column 6, column 7. So if I want to change this, I'll go into my formula bar. I will just change this to an if statement and then say if column of my current cell, so D22, minus my toggle, so the number of months I'm searching, F4 to lock that in place, is greater than 0, then I want to perform the rest of my formula. Otherwise, I want a value of false. So if I copy that, I'll paste it through the rest of my sheet. And now you can see that we're not showing May where we would be if we showed the if error. This is just a really simple way to set that up and hide the months that do not have full sets of data. If I change this to 12, you can see it updates accordingly and shows all the months, and it starts in December. And if I show 3, it starts in March. Very dynamic approach to calculating how many customers I've had in a given time frame. 2 quick bonus tips here, just in case you're curious. I have removed the zeros here because I think it's easier to view. The way I did that was I just highlighted the selection, Control 1, go up to number, and I have a custom number format. If you don't know, the first argument in a custom number format is positive, second is negative, third is blanks. So if I wanted to maybe put a blank as a dash, I can use quotation mark dash, and that will make all of my zeros into a dash. I've just decided to make them blank, which you can do by simply typing 0 for positive, don't show negative, and then if I just use a third semicolon, it will just return nothing for my blank cells. The second thing I've done is I have put in conditional formatting. If you go Alt HL R for manage rules, cells that contain a blank value, I have just set to this gray. So anytime my if error returns a blank value, if I change this to 6, it will automatically gray out the cells that are blank. Makes it easy to understand which cells are working correctly and which cells are not.